Welcome to the Mobile Workforce Podcast, where we sit down and have real conversations with business leaders that have been where you are. During these interviews, we'll dive into what it takes to improve systems and champion processes that maximize performance. Each week, our trailblazing guests share their experiences and understanding of the workforce to help inspire change, challenge our thinking, and share what it takes to successfully travel the road to profitability. Now here's our host, co-founder and chief evangelist of About Time and WorkMax, Mike Merril.
Hello and welcome to the Mobile Workforce Podcast. I am your host, Mike Merril, and today we are joined by the wonderful Cody Rich. Cody is a serial entrepreneur and the founder of Backcountry Fuel Box, and also the host of the Rich Outdoor Podcast, one of my favorite podcasts to listen to in my spare time. With two successful companies under his belt, Cody knows a thing or two about implementing and improving business processes and structure. One of the biggest challenges that we'll talk about today are the unintentional roadblocks that sometimes owners can place or create for themselves. So Cody's going to share what he feels are three common struggles that owners are facing. And if you own a construction business or want to someday, I think you'll really enjoy this episode. So hello, Cody. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, how's it going, Mike? Glad to be on.
Going great. Thank you. Really appreciate you joining us. So I mentioned in the intro that you're a serial entrepreneur. So can you share a little bit about your background and why you love to tinker with new ideas so much and really focus in on solving problems?
For sure. So, I guess my most current background, and most people know me as a hunting podcast host. But like you said, I, eat, sleep, and live businesses and startups and those things. I got into that world and went deep. And so I run Bozeman Entrepreneurs. I consult with multiple entrepreneurs. And that's kind of been my world. But, for your guys' listeners, I'm just a dumb farm kid who grew up with seventh generation grass seed farmer. And so I come from a really, really, really small town. And, all of my friends are farmers or contractors. My brother-in-law owns a big excavation company. And so I know that world at least enough to be dangerous. And it's interesting to me because, my last 10 years are very much, in startup land and these businesses and how to structure businesses. And one of my goals personally is kind of, how do I help entrepreneurs get through the struggles that I had early on. I had this idea that I was going to create a business and go hunting all the time. And it turns out that's way, way harder than it sounds. And so, I like to help entrepreneurs get to there. And this is a pretty applicable podcast because, I just was on a hunt with my brother-in-law, and this is the conversations we were having is like, how do you scale a business, in the construction space to get to the point where you can hunt at least more often, maybe not as much as you want, but at least more often. And so, I think a lot of these problems that I try to solve for all kinds of entrepreneurs are perfectly applicable to a lot of the construction industries. And I have a lot of those conversations even on my podcast, from, general contractors to builders to custom home builders to, excavation guys, all these things. So stoked to be on, kind of stoked to talk about some of the philosophies and mindsets, or I guess frameworks that I put into a lot of businesses to help entrepreneurs get the most out of their business. And also that whole work-life balance thing, which is kind of a joke, but we're going to dive into that as well.
Yeah, I love that. You're definitely a great fit for our listeners. I think, again, your entrepreneurial background is certainly long-lasting and a little bit more broad than what a lot of us do. A lot of us get stuck in one direction that we're focused on, and not necessarily stuck. Maybe it's a path we choose, but you definitely have a diverse background, so that's really cool.
And I hate the term successful because I don't even look at myself as successful. I the same way with my podcast or with businesses, I'm on a step. There's been a lot of lessons learned, and it's almost scary to think that I've been doing this for 10 or 12 years, but there's people I learn from, and I try to be a sponge. So I don't want to come on the podcast and say I'm an expert, which I don't think, anyone assumes, but just for clarification, it's tough because there's still multiple things within our businesses that I'm struggling with or working on. And so it's an ever moving target. But that's the fun thing about business. It is an ever moving target. And I think that, one of the things I'd like to get to, and we're going to talk about, is what got me here won't get me there. And it's like this ever evolving mindset that has to keep shifting as you grow your business, because, as your business grows, you kind of scale into more problems, different problems, and those things.
Yeah, man, I love that term. What got you here won't get you there. Tell me a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great book called "What Got You Here Won't Get You There," and it really shifted my mindset on a lot of things. But once you kind of have that framework of, all these things, when you start out a business, you're just trying to keep the doors open, right? You're trying to get paid, and you're, let's say you're just trying to keep employees fed, employees happy, employees from leaving, all these things, right? And you're dealing with that. And you're just trying to make enough jobs to get it to work. And then pretty soon, you're trying to buy back time. You're like, man, I'm working 80 hours a week. Like I got to figure something out. Right. And so then you're trying to do that. And it's just a different scaling problem, right? It's about changing things. It's about changing cultures, like getting employees to do what, be happily do what they want to do. And how do you work yourself out of your own company and those things? I mean, I don't know if we're on take off on, the first one of being the bottlenecks and those things. Or if you want to, how do you want to go about it, Mike?
Yeah, let's talk about bottlenecks. What are some examples of bottlenecks that companies experience that maybe they put in the way of themselves?
So I think we're all guilty of this, and especially me. Like I've been guilty of this, and it's one of those things that I have to come back and remind myself of constantly. But we are our own bottleneck. So when you start a company and you're in the mud, you're in the trenches, so to speak. You're just working, and I think we all go through this where it's tough to hire someone because I can do it faster, and I don't have time to explain it to someone, but I think as you mature and you realize that like I just can't possibly do everything, that's a bottleneck, right? And that's usually the first one that you come to is like hiring people takes up time. I don't have time, but you realize that you can't possibly keep going at that rate. So that's a bottleneck, right? So that's how you, the owner, becomes a bottleneck. And I think this goes throughout a business life cycle, and this problem just kind of grows as you grow, right? So how I really want to push on entrepreneurs or business owners. And even, we were talking about this, like even superintendents, like how are you becoming the bottleneck? We put so much reliance on ourselves that like we are the thing, we are the reason this business is successful. And that's great. But at the end of the day, like how are you being the bottleneck? And that's one of the most important questions I think anybody can ask themselves, like, oh, how am I becoming the bottleneck? And it's one of those things where we try to have value, we try to be important. We want to think that, yeah, we're the reason, right? And I don't care if this is the business, the owner down to the superintendents, like you're basically trying to make yourself valuable to some extent. And at the end of the day, like how are you becoming the bottleneck? And it's a balance of not being the bottleneck, working yourself out of the system. So for me, and a lot of what I teach is like how to basically be able to go and do the things you want to do. I don't really care if that's going hunting, if that's spending time with your kids, or that's being able to go get more jobs. Like you still need to work yourself out. And I think for me, the goal is always like, how do I take myself out of it and make myself or not make myself the bottleneck? And so from the top to the bottom, don't care what you want to do. It's a matter of like, how do I create systems and empower people to do the things that I can do or teach them how to do the things I can do. And that's a really tough step for a lot of business owners.
Yeah. So what are a couple of examples of, like, let's say somebody in a construction business, they specialize in something, and they feel like they're the only one that can do that thing. And I've been
Yeah.
in that boat as an owner many times where, oh, I got to be there. It has to be me. I've got to be involved.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's exactly what you're talking about. But what are some ways that people can work through that?
Well, let's just take excavation as an example. Like, usually you start out, you're an owner operator, right? And then you can run a hoe faster than anyone. And you hire a guy and he can't do it quite as fast or quite as good. So you might as well just do it your damn self. And this becomes so common, right? But like you can't scale, you can't go get new business. you can't work on relationships if you're the one running the machine all the time. And so this is super common, right? And then finally you hire an operator, and yeah, he does 80% of the job you do, but then you're always working and managing them, right? So now you got, let's say, a crew of three, and you seem to just be bouncing around being a firefighter. I always joke that like I went to school to be a firefighter and then I became an entrepreneur, which is ironic because that's exactly what you are, is just a firefighter. And as an entrepreneur, the next bottleneck usually becomes like the firefighter. And that's where you get to this point where you're like, okay, I got five guys, now I need a super who can manage these people, because you always have to look at yourself as like, what is the next thing? What does moving forward look like for our business or our company? Is that new, or is that expanding lines? Sometimes like let's just say like you specialize in doing a particular thing like solar, right? And so your job, is it to go get more solar to build a bigger crew and specialize in that niche thing, or is it to how do we expand, how do we grow to the next things? But that always needs to be looked at as like, what is your job, what do you want your job to be, and how do you get there?
Hmm. So one of the things that I know you've talked about in the past is team building, and that being a component of working through these bottlenecks. How would that relate or improve the situation?
you know it goes back to like, hey, this is our biggest problem, is like I can do everything. And I always say you have to give your managers and or your team, it doesn't matter, I always say a line of credit, right? So a line of credit is like you have to trust them. For me, I just hired a new gal, and I'm like, hey, um any decision under $100 needs to be your decision. And that usually grows like that. For this one, it was like by 500 by Monday, like we don't have time for those. So like I have to empower those people to be able to make decisions. And the metric can change. Like you could change like, hey, whatever, it's a $10,000 $100,000 decision, I don't really care. But by empowering those employees, like you give them more to work for than just a paycheck. And I think, that's another big piece of it. A lot of people want to say like, oh, how do you keep good employees? Right. Like that's the end all be all question. And I think it boils down for me to more than just dollars. I think it's important to pay your people well. And it's important to get, the benefits and all these things. But like at the end of the day, is that really what's keeping employees? And in my experience, I don't think it is. And I think it boils down to purpose and meaning and being trusted, right? Like your kids, for example. Like if you give them an allowance, it doesn't mean they're going to work harder. But if they feel special, then they're going to work harder, or they know they're appreciated, or they get to think for themselves, like that tends to work better. Employees are no different, and not to demean employees, but it's like, humans want to be valued and appreciated. And so like, how do we instead give them the power to make decisions? And this is by and large going to fix your own bottleneck problem, right? So if you're an owner, you need to let your superintendents run their own line of credit, right? And this grows. And so you don't just give them free will to make decisions, but you come up with a metric, whether it's a dollar number. That seems to be a good baseline. You say, okay, hey, anything under a $5,000 decision, like I trust you to make that decision. And what that's going to do, like that's going to create more trust, more value, right? And there's always holes in the strategy, and there's going to be people that don't pan out. But like if you create that expectation, it should trickle down the line. So, if you're a superintendent, the same thing. Like I think there's a lot of supers that want to feel like they want everything, or they're doing the right thing. Like it's won or lost on their shoulders, and their team is just, these peons that do their work for them. And that's such a bad mindset. And I think you need to create that culture that trickles down. They're like, hey, you trust the super to make the right decisions. Anything under $5,000, like that's his decision. He needs to make it, which is only going to free up your plate. But at the same time, I think like the even the most grunt ditch digger needs to be able to make his own decisions too. So you can't have like supers that are just micromanaging everything. And that it's just a trickle down building that culture. And that comes from top down. And we hear this all the time, right? Like culture comes top down. Well, you as the owner need to be creating this culture within that goes top down. And you need to like push it a little bit, because not every super is going to want to like empower every ditch digger, right? Or every operator. And so like those things have to trickle down. And that's why culture really is, to me, is so important. And it can be tough though. And don't get me wrong. I know people are like, hey, well, it's easy in your industry, but in mine, it's totally different. But I don't know. I kind of disagree with that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're onto something there. It's just people, right? We're all just people and
Right.
have similar thoughts, feelings, emotions, wants, needs.
Hmm. Yeah. And in the fire industry, it's like, you have this trickle down ladder. And I think that's really applicable, but you have to be able to trust the lowest level firefighter to be able to do everything he's going to do. And that firefighter's got to feel like he can make decisions. He's got to feel like he knows what he's doing. Now, sometimes the captain's going to slap you upside the head and say, no, we're going to do it this way. And there's going to be a butting of heads, but like, man, culture is so important. And I think if you want to get, as an owner, we see one of the bigger problems is like, how do I work myself out of this? I can't work myself out of this. Like my guys expect me to be there. I don't know that those two are necessarily perfectly in sync, right? Like as an owner, I've seen this a lot of times where owners have a struggle to leave because their guys are like, well, the owner's just effing off all the time. Why don't I get to just F off all the time? To me, that's like a sign of toxic culture. Like you have to embed that from the beginning. And sometimes that can be really hard as that transition. As you go from owner operator and you have, a couple guys and you guys are all working tight knit together, like all of a sudden the owner wants to go do whatever he wants to do. Say he wants to go on a 10-day hunt. Those things are like, sometimes it can be really hard, but again, going back to like what you got you here won't get you there. If your goal is to do $10 million a year, then you working inside the company is not going to get you there. You're going to be stuck at that middle ground for a long time.
Yeah, you talked about culture and confidence, and I think that's a good term, building a culture of confidence that your employees know that they can be trusted and that they are trusted. And the firefighter example, I just keep thinking, and that literally is a life and death situation in many, many scenarios. If
Right.
you're out there fighting a fire, you can't say, hey, Captain, what should I do? I mean, you have to be empowered to make those decisions or
Right.
you might be risking your life.
Right. And I mean, in most construction and most businesses, like that's probably not the case. But at the same time, like that's why it's easy to let those things slide. Is, if you're an officer and you got a bunch of firefighters, like they know they have to be able to make decisions. Whereas in a business, it's easy for me, say I'm the owner, right? And I'm just telling everyone what to do. And every time someone comes to ask me, I give them the answer. But instead, maybe try to say, hey, what would you do? Like it's so simple. Like, I don't know, tell me what you do. And here's you can slight corrections, right? Like I do this all the time. I'm like, well, what's your thought? And people are like taken aback. And well, I don't know. Well, what would you do? And like it boiled down to that fourth question. And then, even if it's wrong, sometimes I'll let them go. I'll say, okay, let's try it. And then we'll come back to it. Because at the end of the day, sometimes I don't have all the answers. Like I know that like just because this is the way I would do it may not be the perfect way. And I think in construction is more black and white. Like here's how it's done, right? And so it's almost easier to say like, well, what would you do? And then like tweak that. Okay, here's how we could do it better. But make that decision. And sometimes this is very true that employees get in habits, right? It's easier to go ask for a decision than it is for me to make a decision. And so you almost have to force those like, hey, stop asking me. You know what to do. That's why you get paid what you do. Like, let's do this. And like, that maybe it's a tough love thing and that seems to work sometimes and then blow up in others. But at the end of the day, it's like you have to kind of force those people to start thinking for themselves. You've seen employees where, they've been at companies where every decision is made for them. They're just basically doing this thing. And so that can be a big shift in just the type of culture that they've been in to the culture you're trying to create. And that's why, culture is so important within a business. I don't care what kind of business, whether it's construction, whether it's, e-commerce, whether it's a media company, like all these things, like they become important because at the end of the day, like that's what's driving you to get to the next level and just having clear, concise goals on what that looks like.
Yeah, you mentioned culture, and before we hit record, you said something that kind of struck me. You said even with as your company was growing, even with like 14 employees or even under 20, sometimes people don't necessarily really know each other even. So what can you do to help them have more camaraderie as a unit instead of just 14 individuals?
Yeah, and you see this happen a lot in my space. I'll talk about because I know it better than some others. But like what happens is, and everyone's seen this, where it's 3 to 5 employees is a team, and it's pretty tight knit. And then all of a sudden, when you have multiple job sites, or you have 20 employees, and it just switches usually between like 10 and 15 employees, it becomes like us versus them. And like that's a interesting thing to watch is when it becomes the employees become a team, right? And then all of a sudden it's like management is this other team. Um, you have to be cognizant of that and work towards it. And whether that's, cracking beers or, bringing pizza to the job sites and things like that, it's creating that camaraderie of this is, or being transparent with what you do. So, a lot of resentment comes when you have an owner that is just mysteriously gone, right? And like it is like, oh, he's must be off drinking mai tais at the beach or whatever. But when you have a clear, concise company structure, like, hey, here's what I'm doing, and as much as it doesn't seem like the entire company needs to know what you're working on, and sometimes that helps create or get away from that division of us versus them when it comes to management and every other employee. So like when you build that culture, like it's just so different. It goes back to like what got us here won't get us there. Is you have to understand that culture is very different at 5 employees than at 15 employees, and there's just different struggles, right? And as long as you have that concept, I think every company is slightly different, right? Every company's got its own problem. Some is going to be us versus them. Some is just going to be bickering within employees or like people who don't get along. Say you got, the best operator in the world, but he doesn't get along with anyone. That can really crush a company. And I think it's important to build companies that mesh together well. I would take an operator that is 80% as good as another operator, but fits well with the team because the team is going to operate as a whole better.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, is there a mentality that the owner needs to have? Is there some advice you would give as a approach to making these kinds of adjustments within their business?
So one of the things that I do is, really just taking an interest. I think it sounds so cheesy and overrated, but at the end of the day, like taking an interest in what your employees want and why, like, hey, what's your goal? Blah, 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 blah. And I really take pride in that and like kind of knowing each of my employees and understanding their wants, desires, and where they're trying to get to. Not everyone does that. And sometimes that's not applicable, right? But like, I do think at least, if an employee is going to be with you for the long term, you should like, hey, what are their interest goals, plans, those things, and how do I help them get there as they help me get to my goals, right? And so the simplest thing is like taking an interest, and you know, there's definitely a mentality of like not getting too close to employees, which there's a fine balance, right? But it goes back to like what got you here won't get you there. And when you have 3 employees, it has to be different than at 50 employees, right? But I think it's important for company culture to have a relationship with those employees. And I don't care if you got, 50 employees, at least knowing them, maybe not knowing everything about them, but like knowing them so they know you. And I think that face to face, it can go a really long ways.
Yeah, so you're saying have a relationship
Have a
with
relationship. How basic is that, right?
yeah, and it's interesting as you're talking. The last few days, I've been doing some interviews. We're hiring a marketing position, and so one of the questions that I've been asking is, what are your goals with this position? What
Mhm.
what do you hope happens? And most all of them said, well, we want to grow. We want to grow the company. And
Yeah.
so then I dig in further and say, what does that mean? And with 5 different people, the answer was different with all of them. I mean, it all had a money component, but one of them actually said, no, I mean like grow individually. As individuals, I hope we all grow together, and that's what pushes the growth of the company, and ultimately the revenue is going to come because of that internal personal growth as a team, which was really interesting.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's getting really clear about your goals and your struggles, right? So when it comes to hiring, we tend to hire what we think the company needs, right? Or like what's the biggest thing that we don't want to do. That's a really common one. Like, man, I hate bidding jobs. So I'm gonna hire someone to bid the jobs. But looking at it is like, okay, if we look at like where do we want to be and what's our 5-year, 10-year goals and who's the best person for that. this goes back to being the bottleneck, right? So if you're the bottleneck and say, yeah, you hate bidding jobs, but you're probably the best person for it, then maybe that's where you need to be. And maybe you set out a goal to say, okay, in 3 years, I'm not going to be that person. This is 100% kind of where I'm at. Like there's jobs I hate doing. But every time I hire for them, it slows the company growth because no one's going to do it well. And like, it's like my lack of desire for that particular job is the bottleneck, right? So, it may not be it's my personal bottleneck, but that's not the company's, it's the company's bottleneck. So there's just kind of a difference. So, you know what I mean? Like, it's like if I don't want to do it and it sucks, but it's going to help the company get where it is until I can find someone that can do it as well as I can. And for me, a lot of what that means is that I need to create a better system. So I look at all my companies as like building systems. So I build systems to test things to get myself out. Like that's how I solve bottlenecks. So in this particular case, right? So there's a job I really hate doing, but I can't seem to hire people to do it as well as I can, which just means that I don't have a good enough system. And so like I evaluate a lot of things on systems, kind of before the podcast, and we've talked about this before. One of my goals, frameworks, I should say, is that, every September I leave to go elk hunting. And that's kind of like a hard, fast rule for me. And what that does is it's a litmus test for how well my companies are doing. So I should be able to leave in September and take 3 weeks off. And if there's a problem, that means that I didn't build good enough systems. For me, that's the ultimate litmus test is like, can I leave? And, what would it look like? So, the very first time this happened, it was like, I read this book called The 4 Hour Work Week, and it was like, okay, what if you were diagnosed with cancer and you couldn't work for a month or whatever? What would that look like? And you really start to think about these things. And to me, it's a great litmus test for like, okay, are my systems operating correctly? And I think it's easy to get wrapped up in the day to day and getting jobs and doing jobs. But at the end of the day, like we have to look at our company as systems. And I want to take myself out of that. That's my goal. So every year on September 1, it's like, okay, can I leave? And granted, me in the first year that fell apart completely. Right. And every year since then, it's been going on for like 10 years. And I get much better. And there's good years and bad years where I leave. But this goes back to building that line of credit with my employees so they know they can handle these things and I should be able to leave. That's the culture I wanted. So that's the culture I created. And I like from the first hire and every hire after, like, I'm like, that's my goal. My goal is to leave in September and be able to do so with everything running smoothly. And then how do I get there? So my job for 11 months out of the year is to build systems.
I love it. I even for my position here, and I think back to my construction days, and I remember that first trip to Disneyland when my kids were 4 and 2, and a homeowner freaking out that I was leaving, and so I hadn't even trained my customers to realize that, hey, I have a life too. So your point is very well taken by me directly. So I hope the listeners are realizing, you've got to make yourself replaceable in terms of your role and the things that you do day to day so that you could leave. I love that advice, Cody.
You have to be very intentional about your goals or they won't happen. And one of my good friends, Brian Barney, he's a builder and he leaves. That dude hunts more than I do, I think. And him and I have talked about it on my podcast of like, how do you design your? He's like, you just have to be intentional, and you go into these things like. Yeah, he was saying, and I think this is very true. Like a lot of contractors will try to hide the fact that they're going to be gone. You're like, oh, I got this other thing. You don't want to tell your clients, but it turns out that if you're just really open and honest with your clients and you have a good team, they're not really going to care, right? Like their only worry is that things go well. Like that. At the end of the day, they want the job done. They want it at the right price and they want it done well. Right. So if you're gone or not gone, I think it's better to be transparent about those things and say, okay, hey, listen, like I'm going to be gone. But here's my guy that's going to be your point of contact from this point on. You make the introductions and like, this is kind of how it works. And you'd be surprised, like, when you just when you go at a problem like, hey, this is how we do it and this is how it's done, most people aren't going to have a problem with that. Yeah, there's always going to be the dude that's like, well, I hired you and blah 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 blah. Well, make a note of that. And that's not the kind of customers we want from now on. Like at the end of the day, like it's about being very intentional of what your goal is. For me, that goal is to leave every September and working very diligently to build the team and the culture around that happening and making it happen. Like I have to move towards that. And for me, like leaving is a litmus test of how well I built my systems.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And as I think back too, it's the same thing. It could be just golfing, right? I mean, that's a
Yeah,
really common
totally.
one. I remember my subs like, well, actually, golfing. And it's like, oh, well, you failed the inspection. We got to get this fixed today.
Right.
And now I'm ruining his golf game. And he's, so again, if my plumber would have had a system where I'm not calling him the owner directly, I'm calling his guy who's not golfing, then I wouldn't have messed up his golf game, and he wouldn't have had to worry about it.
So that's the bottleneck, right? And like
Right.
these things happen, and that's a litmus test, right? Like, his crew failed inspection, and we got to be back there. Like, didn't get to go golfing today. But like, instead of being like, God dang it, why don't you fix this? Shoot, darn. Like, it's like, okay, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Like, what processes can I build so I don't have this problem? And like that's it. Like, just keep building processes until you solve all the problems, your biggest headaches. We sit here and be like, man, I go back to this firefighter analogy. Like, I'm constantly the firefighter in my own company. And half the problem is that those problems are always changing and they're always growing. Right. And so like, I'll solve one problem and up pops two more. But that's life. It's like, as soon as you cut off the head of one snake, here out pops another. But that's the game to me, is like, how do we build these systems and solve these problems? And then when you get really good at this, it's like, okay, how do I empower my people to solve the problems so I don't have to? How do I get the people to be cutting off the snakes' heads so I'm not doing it for them?
Yeah, and I think most people, they just like, in those interviews that I was conducting, they have a goal for their business, they have a goal for their family, for their life. They've got hobbies and pursuits, like I
Yeah.
said, whether it's hunting or golfing or camping or traveling or whatever it is. There's somewhere else they would like to be on occasion, and probably should be, for a healthy balance.
Yeah.
And everything you're talking about building a culture where there's trust, where people they're not afraid to make decisions because they've done it before, right?
Another thing I like, I constantly harp on, for a lot of entrepreneurs, is like, when we first start out, we all just trying to make money, right? Like, that's the goal number one, is like, how do I work for myself, make money? And then you get money and you realize they're like, I really actually just want time. So we have to restructure our companies so that we can actually have money and time. And, then we get to money and time, and then we're like, okay, what am I really doing here? And so purpose is like the third wheel of that. And so then we have to like kind of restructure our entire company or pivot in a way that, we can actually have money, time, and purpose. And I think it's really important to stop and sit down and think, how do I work towards at least time? Purpose isn't for everyone, but like at least time, because that's inevitably, if you look at every business owner before you, and a lot of my mentors, they all made money, and then they were trying to figure out how to have money and with time. And that's like the ultimate thing. Right. And so think about, as you build your systems and you build, your culture and all these things, like, even if you don't want it now, time is what you'll be after once you get there. Look at all the like all the business owners before you. They all built money, and then they built these empires, and they're like, I wish I had time. So they want to build time. And I think in order to get to time, you have to have a great team. You have to focus on team. So, as you're sitting there today and you're like, man, I'm just trying to get more contracts, more money, more money, more money. Also, I think it's important to think about, how do you build a culture and build a team, because a team is what's going to get you to having money and time.
Hmm. Yeah, you used a term earlier that I really liked. You said buyback time.
Yeah.
It's like, you're still fighting for the time, even though you've been fighting for money the whole time, and now all the money you earned, you got to spend it to go buy that freedom back, because now, like you said, whether it's now or later, you're going to want to have some time.
Right. And this is, it's classic conversation, is is, the one I was having. I was on a spring bear hunt with my brother-in-law, and and he's like, he kind of went through that 2008 recession, and I think it startled him, and man, they were like just scraping by, right? And so after that happened, it was just like, be super conservative, pay off everything, and just work, 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 take every contract you have. And I think you're seeing a lot right now, like construction's booming and everyone's like taking in money while they can because they don't know how long it's going to last. But don't get in the rat race of just money and jobs and trying to hoard that and pay off equipment, because at the end of the day, like when things go bad, you got to have good systems, or you're just saving money. And I think the systems is like what I try to teach entrepreneurs. And I get it because I get stuck in the rat race of just like trying to keep the lights on, trying to pay the bills, and that is a rat race in its own, but that's its own bottleneck, right? Like you have to be able to build systems to build a great company on top of that.
Well, and the thing that is rolling around in my brain is I'm thinking of this analogy like with our children and
Mhm.
how we build trust with them and how we allow them to grow. And eventually they are going to be making their own decisions, whether we like it or not. And they're
Yeah.
not always going to be what we want, but
There's
hopefully,
in the retirement homes, they tell you, not to do things for people that they can do themselves. And I think this is true with kids, right? Like, if you dress your kid and do everything for him every day, is he going to learn to do it on his own? And no. And so the same with elderly or anybody managing a lot of injury. They say the same thing, is like, don't do things for them that they can do themselves. And I think this isn't true with employees, right? Like, sometimes it's easier just do it for them, but they're never going to learn and they're just going to be more reliant on you. So the more you can kind of let them struggle and fail, the better. And also, it's like your kids. Like if you just give them the answer, it's they're not going to learn as well as if they have to struggle to figure it out, right?
yeah, if you end up being their Google.
Right. Like you become the easy button, right? And you become the staples button. And that can be as toxic to a culture. And I don't want to like harp on that whole thing, but it's like, man, you have to let them struggle to figure it out. And I think this is as much, I think most owners get pretty good at this. I think it's a mid-level problem. I think there's a lot of superintendents because they don't have the necessarily like freedom to walk away, right? So a superintendent's usually trying to hold on to his job, and like he's trying to try to add value to the company, and he sees that value in his ability to make decisions and do things, right? But and it's different because like the owner's trying to work himself out of a company, where the super is just trying to like justify his payment. Um, I think there's multiple ways to go about that. If you're a superintendent, like you can also be very, very valuable by building a great team. Like that is powerful. Like I will gladly pay you 120, $150,000 a year for a team that runs perfectly smoothly and I have zero problems with it, right? Or I have zero fires to put out. That's efficiency. And so like building those things. And so when you look at that mid level, you have to, the reason you have owners and you have, let's say employees, that are high level employees, one has job security and one has risk, right? So the owner takes the risk of time or the risk of losing everything for the benefit of time. And I think it's easy as owners to look and assume that supers or like any high level employee is going to be the same. But their big benefit is one is they get to go home and leave the problems at the door. You don't. And but the trade-off is like they have security, right? And so maybe they get a pickup and $120,000 a year job. Like that's really handy. They leave all the problems at the door when they clock out. And so like that's what they want out of life. And maybe they don't want to go, spend a month and off doing everything, but at the same time have risks 24/7. So I think every position has trade-offs, and it's easy for owners to like put their own desires on all of their employees, which I don't think is always true. So like goes back to like understanding your employees. Like you got a high level manager and he's like, oh man, hey, what's your goal? Like, man, I just want to make good money, hang out with my kids, be able to offer them the life I didn't have. That's probably a really common answer, right? So like, how do you provide that? You're like, great, my goal is XYZ. And I think you can help facilitate a lot of those goals, but we as owners tend to put our hopes, desires, wishes on our employees as if they're the same. But like, not everyone has a risk tolerance, right? Like, not everyone's an entrepreneur, not everyone's a risk taker. So us as owners tend to like be like, oh man, they probably want to start their own company or these things. I don't think that's necessarily true. And I think, if you can offer them the ability to have money, time, security, which is probably what they're wanting, then they'll probably be a great employee for forever, right?
Yeah, I've heard it said many times by lots of entrepreneur coaches and inspirational leaders and people out there. I'm sure you've heard the same phrase. And it's basically, if you want to get what you want, you've got to help other people get what they want.
100%, 100% agree with that.
So we got to start by asking. We got to ask them, what do you want?
Yeah. What do you want?
What's your goal? What does that mean to you? And then drill down till you get to the finite answer.
There's a funny thing too, because like when you ask people that, they think you're like scheming. Like I just hired one of my new hires. I'm like, hey, where do you want to? Blah, blah. And like I think she was like trying to give the textbook answer. I'm like, no, really. Like, and you sometimes have to work through that. You can't just like go to an interview like, hey, what do you want? They're gonna give you the textbook answer. They're gonna be like, oh, what's he want to hear? I'm just trying to get the job. Like today, that's what I want. Today, I want a job. But I think if you look at like, I don't know, what the human wants, right? So they want to feel appreciated. They want to be tested. I think that's a big piece of it. When I was working for another company, I think more than my pay, like what kept me there was that people trusted me to do my job and they trusted me to make big decisions. And like, how simple is that, right? That's like actually what the owner wants. He's like, what? I can, whether your pay doesn't matter. It's more about the decisions you make or being able to solve problems. Like it's pretty underrated. It's a pretty cheap thing to give to people.
Well, the difference is you're talking about more personal interior fulfillment than, cash, right? Like you feeling valued is important, right?
Yeah. And I think we all have that. Like, even if you like want to work at a job, like you want to work at a job, you want to get paid 120K a year with a truck. Like that's like your money problem is fairly solved. And now you have security, like job security is the thing. But then like, once you have those things, like you want to be tested. We're humans. Like we all want to be pushed. We all want to grow. And I think those are pretty natural things across most people.
So, Cody, we've talked a lot about putting systems and processes in place. Let's say somebody already has those things in place, they've improved, they're in a better place. I know that you seem to really have a mentality of how else can I improve and streamline and embrace innovation. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, innovating is the name of the game, right? If you're not growing, you're dying. And that can be at odds with, what we were talking about being a bottleneck. So I think it's important to always be innovating and pushing, kind of like questioning. I always say like, question why you'll be out of business in 5 years and then work to not make that happen. Or the same could be said for like, in what capacity, what would put me out of business? And so always be thinking about like, what would happen to put this whole system out of play? And then how do I work towards that or work towards making that not happen? That's a really important thing because it's easy going back to, hey, we get in the day-to-day, the rat race, the hamster wheel, so to speak. And we're just focusing on the little things, but like all of a sudden there's an iceberg ahead and it can sink the ship. And so as you innovate, I think it's important not to be risky, but not risk everything. And so you see people that are like, man, the next greatest thing, right? Oh, like all this innovation, all this money's going towards this thing, and they'll push, and then that thing falls on its face. And so I think it's important to have really, really good systems that are in place to keep the wheels turning and the kind of keep the flywheel turning, but then be always looking and dabbling. But, keep that at a percentage. You say, hey, 20% of new business is going to be XYZ because we think this industry is where it's going, but never enough to sink the ship. Because going back to like thinking about what could possibly sink the ship, like, hey, if we pivot because there's all this money in XYZ, then it could, if that falls on its face, is it going to crush the ship and crush the culture? So I always look at innovation as like, how do we innovate to stay alive, but not completely pivot to sink the ship.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. So I guess to summarize the conversation, which it's been fantastic, what's the one takeaway that you would hope the listeners would have from our conversation today?
I think the one takeaway that I always preach is you have to be intentional about where you're going or you won't get there, and build systems with goals in mind. Simple as that.
Yeah, powerful. Love it. Well, thank you so much, Cody, for joining us today. Had such a great time catching up and also learning from you. I've appreciated your innovative spirit and, of course, our friendship, and look forward to maybe doing this again down the road.
Absolutely, Mike. Thank you for having me.
You bet. And thank you to the guests for listening today to the Mobile Workforce Podcast, sponsored by About Time Technologies and WorkMax. If you enjoyed the conversation that Cody and I had today, please leave us a 5-star rating and review. And of course, share this episode with your friends and colleagues. After all, our goal here is not only to help you improve your business, but also your life.